And we get some age in there too. You said you'd come and get me, but you were 25. So again, it's clearly metaphorical. Peter was not 25 in the Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. Would be a very different book if that were true. He's just vaping in Neverland. Anyways.
But like that's literally
The Peter Pan syndrome, yeah.
Peter Pan syndrome. Oh my god, vaping in Neverland. Oh.
You are listening to AP Taylor Swift, the podcast for Swifties who are all about the lyrics. We're your hosts. I'm Jen.
I'm Muncie.
And I'm Jody.
And we are your unofficial professors of Taylor Swift. Hello, and welcome to another episode of AP Taylor Swift. This week we are diving into a fun topic of Peter Pan songs. So songs about Peter Pan, songs related to Peter Pan, the story of Peter Pan, not just Peter Pan the character. We'll see all the different interpretations we take, but before we get into our songs, Monzi, you want to give us some background and information about Peter Pan the story?
Yeah, totally. So we do different kinds of episodes, and this is one of our literature ones. This one is interesting because Peter Pan originally came out as a play, and then there was also an accompanying novel written by J.M. Barrie. It came out in the early 1900s. I believe the play came out in 1904, and the novel came out in 1911. We'll link out to some information about Peter Pan in the show notes for sure. Over the years, this work of art has definitely been adapted many, many times into, of course, the play has been adapted over times, and then it's also been adapted into various movie adaptations. There have also been several works done on the author himself, J.M. Barrie, who's a very interesting human to try to understand just kind of what went into the creation of this play. J.M. Barrie was said to be ahead of his time in terms of even understanding the child mind, the way that he really kind of understands children throughout this play. He predates Freud, came up with certain ideas that are now recognized to be a part of proper psychology, but at that time were very early and kind of revolutionary. So really interesting dude. There was a BBC series on his writing of the play called Lost Boys, which I have not seen, that came out in the 70s, but there was also a movie called Finding Neverland, which I'm a huge fan of, with Johnny Depp, that kind of explored his character. But what is Peter Pan? Peter Pan is a story about supposedly made-up character that these kids have in their sleep every night. It opens up in a bedroom where the mother, Mrs. Darling, it keeps hearing about this character, Peter. Her kids keep talking about him, and she thinks he's a made-up character, but also vaguely has some memory of this character from when she's a kid. And then one day, her kids actually all end up disappearing because they run off to Neverland with Peter Pan. And Neverland is a place where little kids don't grow up, led by Peter himself, who is kind of the encapsulation of Neverland in one little boy. He has a gang of lost boys who are kids who are abandoned by their mothers or left by the streets, and they also never grow up. And they go on a bunch of adventures there trying to defeat the evil Captain Hook. And eventually there's a reckoning that Wendy and her two brothers, who are the Darling kids, there's a reckoning when Wendy realizes she wants to go home, and she has some memory of her parents, and she decides I want to go home, and even if going home means growing up. It's really a coming of age novel. Ask that question of could you stay young forever? Should we stay young forever? Why does that inner child grow up? Why do we lose that innocence?
And for most of our listeners, I assume you are familiar with the story from the Disney animated film. If nothing else, that was seems like a key millennial and generations above and probably below us. Or the 2003 live action film, which is quite accurate to the book, which is impressive. I was reading the book in preparation for this, and I was like, oh, that film was quite
there's
spot
direct
on.
lines.
Like literally direct lines, yeah. I was like, oh, I'm just reading the script for that movie, I think.
Well, what's interesting is, so I also read the book for the first time, and in the book, the Darlings are like middle class, like they're not upper class, whereas in all of the movie representations, they're shown as this, they're perceived to be this upper class hoity-toity family. But in the book, they really talk about how, they almost gave Wendy away when she was born because they weren't sure they could make it work, and that Nana is a dog because they needed a nanny to keep up with the neighbors but couldn't afford a human nanny.
Interesting. I don't know if I ever interpreted the films as them being high class. I always perceived them as middle class Keeping Up with the Joneses, of trying to
Interesting.
look, because there's like the whole thing in the cartoon with Mr. Darling's like bib that keeps rolling up and he's like losing
Mm,
his mind over it. And that always came across to me of like they feel like they have to look perfectly put together, which is kind of a like trying to keep up
yeah. So
appearances.
here's my turn to admit that I don't love Peter Pan. When I was a child, I was always scared of Captain Hook and the
I was
pirates, and
also
so
scared of the Disney
I would
adaptation.
make my mother I don't know why I kept watching it, but I would make her fast forward through any parts with the pirates, and so I was listening to the book, which I enjoyed, and then I watched the 2003 movie that I did not enjoy just simply because I'm like, it's not a like, I just have these memories as a child of fast forward through most of the movie. I don't love it. So this is gonna be
So
a
Jodie's gonna has to head out. She has other plans. She's gonna be just not into
yeah.
this at all.
Another thing that I think is interesting is I've tried to rewatch the 2003 movie recently, and I do think that when you're not a kid anymore, it is
Yeah.
a completely
Yeah.
different experience. I was obsessed with Peter Pan as a child, and actually not because of the Disney movie. I was also terrified of the Disney movie. The alligator, everything was really terrifying.
Awful.
But something about Finding Neverland made me really appreciate
Mm.
the magic. I think that the way that movie was done, it's first of all beautiful storytelling, but it also focuses a lot more on Peter Pan as a play. And I think I really I watched that when I was a teenager, and I really identified with this being in the middle, having to grow up but not quite wanting to grow up, but
Yeah.
also wanting to grow up. And so I do think it's interesting, like, where you meet this story. There's also a new version that probably none of us have seen, and I don't think it was a huge success, but Jude Law is in it, and it just came out, and it has Peter and Wendy as kid. I think it's called Peter and Wendy. And it came out just a few years ago. I think it's an interesting place for us to be like coming into this and listening to it in terms of Taylor's songs, because she talks about this theme quite a lot. But
Yes.
totally fair that I think depending on when you interact with the story, you can be too young, be scared, be like just the right moment for it, or even be too old for it.
I'm just looking at all the different adaptations, and there's a lot.
I think one thing that is interesting is I've read the play, but I've never watched the play, and I think I would love to see this in theater because I think it would be done very well in theater.
I've seen Finding Neverland, the musical.
Oh, I didn't know that was a musical.
I have seen Peter Pan the play, and I actually remember it being
Yeah.
hilarious. The guy
Really?
who played Hook was really good at physical comedy, and so he made a lot of his scenes very, very funny when he was like sneaking around on stage and stuff. Like he was, I just distinctly remember Hook being hilarious and just really like a good presence.
And then Peter and the Starcatcher
Oh yeah, I've read Peter and the Starcatcher, and then there's
oh,
also the book Hook that was adapted into a movie as
with
well
Robin
With
Williams.
with
Robin
Robin
Williams, yeah.
Williams. Yeah, which is a fantastic follow-up of what happens if Peter were to grow up, which is really interesting.
The reason that we picked Peter Pan is because there are some explicit Peter Pan references throughout Taylor Swift's discography. There are also a lot of implicit references. I think the theme of growing up, never growing up, childhood is a very relevant theme for her music. So I'm excited to see what we've discovered. So I think with that, Monsi, I believe you're up first.
I started with a kind of an unconventional song. I think it wasn't explicitly a Peter Pan song in her discography. I chose the song Innocent, which is from Speak Now. Came out in 2010 originally. Of course, the Speak Now Taylor's version came out in 2023. And I've always loved this song. I love the melody of the song. I love the way that it flows. The thing about this song in particular that to me felt so Peter Pan is, of course, the title speaks to the fact that we're talking about loss of innocence. We're talking about something that comes along and changes somebody's life and makes them kind of lose the child within. And then there are lines where she specifically references that childhood. So, starting with the first stanza, one thing that was really interesting is that there's a little repetition of the word lost. She starts with the song opens with, I guess you really did it this time, left yourself in the warpath, lost your balance on a tightrope, lost your mind trying to get it back. This idea of lost is very prominent in Peter Pan. We have, of course, the lost boys. They're boys who are abandoned by their mothers, get lost in Neverland, so to speak. At the end of Peter Pan, the Darling family actually ends up adopting the lost boys who all come home with the Darling children. And at least in one of the movies, maybe this is the Robin Williams version of Hook, there's one lost boy who's constantly saying, I've lost my marbles throughout. And the idea is that he's just this old man now who's lost his mind essentially.
Aw.
So I think this idea of lost your mind trying to get it back, there's a moment where you realize that he hasn't actually lost his mind. He like literally lost his
Lost his
marbles
marbles. That's
from
adorable.
Neverland. Yeah, which was
Also,
really
you have a
cool.
great memory.
I actually was obsessed with Peter Pan in high school. You're now learning about a secret obsession. So that's kind of how I saw a nice connection there. But then in the second stanza is where we really get these references to childhood. Wasn't it easier in your lunchbox days? Always bigger bed to crawl into. I'm imagining this little kid crawling into the parents' bed. Wasn't it beautiful when you believed in everything and everyone believed in you?
Mm.
And a big theme about Neverland is it's the belief in fantastical things. Fairies exist and can survive if everyone just believes in them. Tinkerbell almost dies, but the belief in fairy is what brings her back to life. It's all right, just wait and see. Your string of lights still bright to me. We're getting into the chorus, and the string of lights to me is not a direct Peter Pan reference, but I thought of the stars. To get to Neverland, you have to follow the second star to the morning. And so this idea that these stars could lead to Peter Pan, and who you are is not where you've been. You're still an innocent. This is a great moment for me to just pause and talk about where I see this song fitting into the story. So now that we've gone in a few stanzas, you can kind of get the drift that I think there's these references that could reference Peter Pan. And to me, when I heard this music especially, it felt like a soundtrack song. Imagine at the end of Peter Pan, the whole play is finished, the movie is over. At the end, Wendy comes home and she grows up. And imagine her, like, if it's her POV, you cut to black and then you just have this kind of movie soundtrack song. This song feels like a kind of grown up Wendy reflecting on that childhood and maybe those adventures with Peter Pan. And so when she says you're still an innocent, to me it feels like Wendy has grown up, but there's a part of her that is still an innocent and is just thinking about those experiences of childhood innocence. So did some things you can't speak of. I think there's this interesting also memory aspect of Peter Pan where when they're in Neverland, they start to forget the real world. And conversely, when they're in the real world, they start to forget Neverland. And so I think it's one of these experiences that they can't really speak of. And then the line, wasn't it beautiful running wild until you fell asleep? There's a beautiful line at the beginning of this book that says, in the 2 minutes before you go to sleep, Neverland, becomes very nearly real. That's why there are nightlights. And this idea that right in that moment when you're falling asleep is when you kind of escape to Neverland. This line of, wasn't it beautiful running wild till you fell asleep before the monsters caught up to you, to me really kind of reflects that. These are just some of the things. It's kind of sprinkled throughout, but if you think of it through that lens, that's kind of where I was coming at, of just grown-up Wendy thinking about the old days and how 32 is still growing up. But she's still an innocent.
I love this. In Taylor Swift by the Book, the interview we did with the authors Rachel Feder and Tiffany Tatro a couple weeks ago, they also call Speak Now Taylor's fairy tale era. There's a lot of the stories, a lot of the songs, excuse me, on that album reference fairy tales, and I think that Innocent is no exception here. I think Never Grow Up would be the other one that I would pull from this album, another slightly explicit reference to Peter Pan. Literally says, "I'll never grow up, never grow up." Now I can sing the song. That part I do remember from the musical. But I think Innocent is I'd call it a hauntingly beautiful connection to Peter Pan, very poignant connection to Peter Pan.
I think, first of all, when you started talking, I was thinking too, I'm glad you connected it to Wendy because as an adult revisiting the story, my number one takeaway is Peter Pan is not an innocent character.
Right?
He has
No.
cut off hands, he kills Hook. At the end, she like sees him again a few years later and she's trying to talk about Hook and he's like, I never remember them after I killed them. And I was like,
I'm literally gonna
sir,
bring that line up in mine.
sir.
Yeah.
Anyways.
No, you're absolutely right. I think
So problematic.
I think the kids who escape to Neverland are the
Right. The
innocents.
innocence.
And yeah, I mean, Neverland is full of monsters. It's not just a nice place. It's not.
That's why I fast forwarded through the whole thing.
Yeah, it's actually quite scary. And in many ways, the symbolism in this book, like Hook encapsulates all of the fears that Wendy feels. My favorite thing about this play is that there's a tradition of the dad character also playing
Playing
Hook,
Hook.
which I think
Yeah.
was not intentional initially, but has become this thing that has been carried on.
Wasn't it like Jason Isaacs who did it in the movie, the
So
2003 live
it
action?
dates back to J.M. Barrie's plays, like
Yeah, I'm
even
just
in the
saying
beginning. Yes,
in
yes,
that film
yes.
they did it again with an
Right. So
iconic actor.
Isaac's interpretation is so great. Actors have really run with that and tied the two characters of like the dad being this scary character for the kids, or just this mundane old man, like what happens when your child, the inner child in you, dies, and then
Mm.
Hook being this terrifying creature.
Yeah.
Jason Isaacs is freaking fantastic.
Yeah, he did so good at that. Like that performance really sticks out to
But
me.
yeah, to the point being that Neverland is full of fears. It's a terrifying place,
But
but
Wendy and her siblings are the innocent
the
ones,
kid
not Peter Pan.
exactly, the kids who go there are the innocents.
Yeah, which we'll get to it in my song, but I also point out Peter never pretended to be anything he wasn't. It was like
No.
he just was also adventurous and exciting. Anyways, the other line in this song that I wanted to point out when you said you were thinking about doing this, I love the tightrope comparison in this song because
Yeah.
flying is such a key part of Neverland and a big part of this song at the beginning and at the end. I think it bookends it is lost your balance on a tightrope, lost your mind trying to get it back. And a big
Mm.
thing is as kids, they learn to fly. And one of the core parts of forgetting Neverland or growing up is no longer being able to fly. The Lost Boys lose the ability, Wendy loses the
Yeah.
ability. But the final line adds this like moment of hope of lost your balance on a tightrope. It's never too late to get it back. So
Yes.
almost this song takes that and then twists it and is like, well, everyone grows up, but it doesn't mean you have to fully lose your innocence or your
Mm.
childhood or your that childlike sense of wonder and whimsy. Like you don't have to. It's never too late.
Which you kind of see at the end of the book, where the book ends with Wendy and her daughter, and Peter Pan coming
Yeah.
back for Wendy, and she's like, "I'm an old woman now. This is my daughter."
Yeah.
And unlike Mrs. Darling, who doesn't
Forgot.
quite who forgot about
Yeah.
Peter, Wendy has told the story of Peter to her own daughter, Jane, so that she still has some of that innocence, even though she is older and she did grow up. She still maintains some of that innocence and some of that childlike imagination because she
Yeah.
believes.
Peter promised her that he would come back for her every spring, and he doesn't
Doesn't.
remember. He forgets. So she remembers and is kind of waiting for him, and she sees him come back.
Reading this book made me understand even more so now why it's called like Peter Pan syndrome,
Yeah.
and made me understand the men in San Francisco and New York that much better than the Disney movie or any of the movies ever could. Because oh my god, she go. Why does she go? Promise to go back to clean for spring cleaning? Excuse me.
I mean, to be fair, this was also written in the early
I
1900s, so
understand.
there's like some
And
element
she
of
was their
historical
mother.
criticism. Yeah,
She
but
was their
yes,
mother.
yes.
Exactly. Exactly. As the
Neverland is
single
so
woman
funny.
dating, I don't want to be anybody's but yes, there's a lot of yes, you've
Yeah.
got a historical
We're
context.
100 years later, but yes, the point
Are we
still
though?
stands.
Are we? That's the whole point. Are we?
Literally, the way time goes, yes. Culturally, perhaps not.
Perhaps not. Not we're not far enough. The fact that we have men that we are calling have Peter Pan syndrome, that is horrific when you actually understand the character of Peter Pan.
Well,
Yeah.
it's also like implied, whatever, we don't need to get into these
No,
details too
let's
hard.
get into it. This is great.
That Neverland, like time works different there. And
Yes.
Mhm.
it's like does he they said spring cleaning, which came from some of this reminded me of our conversation about Alice in Wonderland about how the world works different for adults and
Oh,
kids.
interesting.
And the spring cleaning promise I think came from Mrs. Darling if I
Yes.
recall correctly.
Also
And
problematic.
Peter said sure and it's like what
What's
10-year-old
spring?
boy knows what spring cleaning is?
Knows how to
So
clean?
I like reading it as an adult, kind of thinking about that difference. I kind of feel like he may have been in Neverland and just every now and then was like, oh,
Well,
I
because
guess I should clean like
he
every 10
misses.
years.
Well, he misses. He doesn't come back consistently. He like
Yeah.
forgets because to your point,
He
time
forgets.
doesn't work the
Yeah.
same. To me, it reminded me of the hymn to Demeter and the fact that Persephone
Yeah.
is allowed to go back to her mother in the spring, but has to be with Hades in the winter. So does that mean that her parents are Hades in the underworld and Neverland is supposed to be spring? I don't know.
That's
That was the
Yeah.
really
connection
interesting.
that I made.
But yeah, like I kind of feel like Peter doesn't know what spring cleaning is. He was
Of
just
course
like,
he
"All
doesn't.
right."
I think so. Yeah, and I love that. I think one of the reasons that I loved Finding Neverland and this exploration into J.M. Barrie's life is because I do think it's such a brilliantly written book that can be revisited at all ages, even though the movies can
Yeah.
sometimes feel childish or whatever. But
You get something different out of it.
there is something really incredible about the way that he wove in these everyday mundainisms into the fairy tale world. And I think we've talked about that all the time. This is my
Right.
enchanted reference of the day. We talk about this with Taylor, like weaving the lines between the real world and this enchanted fairy tale world. And Jan Barrie, I just think, has done a fantastic job. And that's why it has stood the test of time and really survived. I think it's because it's a book for the ages. And this idea of a cyclical thing where from mother to daughter, you know, kids after kids, generation after generation, they have these adventures. Really, really incredible. And to kind of like end my section on a little bit of a personal note. I remember in high school, this is before I met my husband in high school, and this is right before we met, and I like officially, I guess, gave into adultdom. As an early teenager, I remember I was obsessed with this idea of just don't let that inner child grow up. Don't let it grow up. Still stay fun. I feel like I had a really awesome group of friends where we didn't drink until we got to college. In fact, most of my friends just ended up waiting till we were 21. We were goody two shoes. But we had a lot of really innocent fun where we used to play games and just have a really great time as adults, as young adults, but just kind of, you know, it's still kind of in the innocent space. And I was just obsessed with this idea of like I want to maintain this creativity and sense of adventure for as long as I can. And then I've been thinking about it, but even though I went in with that mindset, you forget how quickly you grow up, and as you know, like life just happens and you get sucked into the mundane and everyday. And I, ever since having my daughter in the last year, like I had heard this from my friends that you start to see the world through their eyes as they're discovering everything. And it has been so eye-opening for me
Hmm.
just how much of that childhood you lose, because I think
Interesting.
it wasn't until I like have started exploring these things and I'm like, "Oh my god, I told myself I wouldn't become this person, but I became that person." And
Yeah.
I don't know, it's really you just kind of have these moments. So I do imagine Wendy with her kid Jane and just the circle moment of being able to kind of like relive the childhood through your kids. So anyways, I really rediscovered this song and enjoyed going through it through that lens.
I love it. I have the second song. I picked Cardigan. This is from Folklore from 2020, written by Aaron Dessner and Taylor Swift. And this is one of the explicit references. She says, Peter losing Wendy. There are other lyrics as well that I'll kind of pull out that I think also refer to Peter Pan, but the line specifically towards the end, I knew you tried to change the ending, Peter losing Wendy. So in the end of the book and the play and everything, Wendy returns to London. She decides she doesn't want to stay in Neverland. She misses her family. Wendy goes back, and Peter doesn't want to grow up, so he stays in Neverland. So Peter loses Wendy in the sense that Wendy chooses to not remain in Neverland. So Wendy makes the choice not to stay. As we mentioned previously, there's this arrangement that she's going to return to Peter and Neverland each spring cleaning. He does come back for her that first year, but then he misses the second year, and then he misses again. And I think it's unclear how often he actually does return. It sounds like he comes back twice total. In the book, it says the years came without bringing the careless boy. And then when he does return finally, Wendy's an adult. She's got her own daughter. She's a married woman. And the book specifically says she was one of the kind that likes to grow up of her own free will. So Peter does lose Wendy, but I get caught up on, and we are going to deep dive this song, so we'll go into it. I knew you tried to change the ending, Peter losing Wendy. So that to me makes it sound like you tried to change the ending that Peter doesn't lose Wendy, that you wanted
Ooh.
Wendy to stay. Well, we can get into that in the deep dive perhaps. So that's the most explicit reference. There are a couple of others. Chasing shadows in the grocery line when we first meet Peter, he's crying because he can't get his shadow to stick to him. He's trying to catch his shadow. And I find this combination of the Peter Pan reference, which references childhood, with the grocery line reference, which is adulthood, just kind of really brings together, smashes together very quite forcefully the child to adult connection
Yeah. It's like adventure versus chores.
versus like chores, mundanity, like just
Yeah.
literally the definition
Routine.
of going
Yeah.
becoming an adult is that I have to go stand in a not even go food shopping, you're standing in a grocery line. Like the worst. And then there's the line, "And I knew you'd come back to me." So, she ends the song, "And I knew you'd come back to me, you'd come back to me." And he does come back, but intermittently. And sort of to your point, Jen, like when he thinks to and when he cares to. But when he comes back, he's forgotten everything that happened. Wendy tries to bring up Tinkerbell, she tries to bring up Captain Hook, and of Hook he says like, once I kill them, I forget them. So I think that these references make this song even more sad than I thought it was when I actually look at what these lines mean in terms of Peter Pan and the reference to Peter Pan. And then finally, when you are young, they assume you know nothing, which is the line that's like repeated again and again and again. And I think that to me kind of encapsulates a lot of Peter Pan, that we assume that it's this story for children and adults forget it because it's like how superfluous, how silly. Adults, especially in this era these of storytelling, assume that children are superfluous. They are just, they need to grow up and become adults, right? Peter goes to Neverland when he overhears his parents talking about what he will become when he grows up. The purpose of children is to grow up, assuming that children mean nothing and know nothing. And here's this song that kind of really is harkening back to childhood, being young, and everything that you know or everything that you feel when you are young. It's not that you don't know nothing, you know a lot.
Yeah, and you listen and you understand. I think there's this line also at the beginning of the book where like the first time that Wendy realized that she would have to grow up is when her mom said something like, "Oh, I hope you always stay this way," or something
Yes.
like that to Wendy, and then she realizes that all kids must grow up.
Mhm.
And the fact that all like her brothers start to forget this in Neverland and she starts to forget it as well. But then she remembers her parents when she's telling a story. And she remembers that she needs to go back and she needs to grow up and chooses to kind of do that. I
Chooses to
think
grow up.
it definitely reveals this maturity in her, even though she's a child. People assume that kids know nothing, but here you have an example of a kid who was very astute.
She was very astute, she picked up on a lot. There's the whole thing about the mother's kiss that she couldn't have, that nobody could have, like,
Yeah.
these children know and understand a lot about their parents and about the world that they live in, that nobody gives them credit for. Even Peter Pan, right? The fact that Peter Pan was like, "Ooh, you're talking about me growing up. I don't wanna grow up. I'm gonna run away." And then he gets
Yeah.
into this Arrested Development, but he was
Mhm.
astute enough to recognize that this is not going to be my life forever, that at some point this changes. So he knows that this is not the way it should be. He knows that Neverland isn't what it's like for everybody, even though there's a lot that this kid doesn't know.
I love the kind of wistfulness of the song too. It's like even though she knows a lot, she still wants to escape to the not knowing anything.
Yeah, I think there's a interesting feminist critique here too of why Wendy remembers and Michael and John don't.
Mm.
And the element of girls having to grow up faster. She was not there playing a lost boy. She was in Neverland playing a
Mother.
mother. And some of just the responsibilities. I think that there may be an element of that too of she was able to remember on kind of both sides at the end when she was older, but when she was a kid, because she was forced to grow up a little bit earlier because she was a girl, but then also because of that, she has held very tightly onto her desire for the whimsy and that narrative. So she's remembered it. But I really do think that there is something there with it. The Lost Boys don't remember. John and Michael forget faster. Yes, Wendy's older. I don't think John it's not implied that John's like 10 years younger than her. Like,
No.
he's
Yeah.
not that far off, but she's the one who remembers.
And there are, in most adaptations of Peter Pan, there's a little bit of this romantic tension where Wendy has a crush on Peter
Oh, yes.
Pan, and he sees her as a mother, but then like kind of as a friend at some, depending on the interpretation. But it's very much one-sided, and it also hints at a thing of maturity, whereas the boys are purely viewing her as this mother platonic character. She has these more adult-like feelings.
Except isn't it her kiss that, like, brings him back to life and
It
gives
is. I
him
mean, there is some dynamic there, and it's really interesting because it also hints at kind of like Oedipus complex
Yes,
type
exactly.
Yeah.
stuff. But the fact that she has this chemistry with this character, I mean, that's a really mature kind of feeling. Like, but girls start to
Right.
have
Feel that a lot
some of that
younger.
realization maybe earlier. Yeah.
Right. Girls mature faster.
Well, do girls mature faster or does society force them to mature faster? Anyways.
Anyway, tune in to our future episode on feminist theory.
All right. Well, we are going to get into that so much more.
Yeah,
So we'll
there's
move on
so
for
much
now.
more to say about that
but-
song, and I think that I'll save it for the deep dive.
Well, and actually, while we're on folklore, I want to give the honorable mention to the song Seven, which we have a lot of songs like this, so we'll maybe go into it in the Substack. But the song Seven also, we noticed, did have a lot of Peter Pan references. Was tempted to do it, but just
There's
it was
only 3 of
depressing.
us, so that really limits how many songs we
And
bring
it's
to a
just
show
a
and
really
tell.
sad song, so I was like, no, not today.
Yeah, it's not what I needed today, so we're moving on. That's fair.
Well, I chose the song Peter. I say I chose. I think Taylor chose for me. To not do Peter was not an option. From the Tortured Poets Department, the anthology track number 28, written by Taylor Swift, a solo Taylor song. So the song is riddled with Peter Pan references. I'm not going to just read the lyrics. I half considered just doing that because that does cover a lot of it. But
We're just gonna play the song. Sorry, we're just gonna like press play on the song.
yeah.
Ready, go.
And that's it. Great. Enjoy it. But obviously, the song is called Peter. Forgive me, Peter, my lost fearless leader. We're right in it. We're in Peter. And then the chorus is, you said you were going to grow up, then you were going to come find me. And then the implication in the story is that absolutely did not happen. I say implication. The straight up narrative says that doesn't happen. The woman who sits by the window has turned out the light. So the woman has given up. Instead of me just reading all the lines, it's using the wider metaphor of Peter and Wendy at the end of the story as this sort of, I'm going to talk about it as if it's a romantic relationship. As always, I think there are other interpretations. I'm just going to stay with Peter and Wendy, make it romantic just for the first round of this conversation. But this idea that they were together and then they decided, hey, we're going to take some time apart perhaps, or we're at a stage in the relationship where this isn't going to work unless you make some changes. And Peter said, I'm totally going to do that. And she was like, great, let me know when that happens. And then we actually don't know, which is interesting about this side of the story. In the book Peter Pan, Peter keeps coming back. So Wendy's confirmed he's not growing up. She sees him come take her daughter. But in this version, the song Peter, we don't really know what happened to Peter. We don't get that conclusion. But we get the other side. We get quote unquote Wendy's story. She turns out the light. She's given up. And we get some age in there too. You said you'd come and get me, but you were 25. So again, it's clearly metaphorical using this Peter thing. Peter was not 25 in the Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. Would be a very different book if that were true. He's just vaping in Neverland. Anyways.
But like that's literally
The Peter Pan syndrome, yeah.
Peter Pan syndrome. Oh my god, vaping in Neverland. Oh,
Someone make a modern adaptation with Gen Z or Gen Alpha.
it's literally gonna be some like startup bro
Stop, no, this is
in
too
Fine Eye vaping on his in the back of a Waymo or something. I don't know.
Oh no.
Love a Waymo.
But what I thought was really interesting about this song as using Peter as the metaphor is a couple of things. in the song, Peter like said you were gonna grow up is a line, but she uses Peter Pan as the metaphor, and
And
you
he
know
does.
in Peter Pan he will never grow up. He
Right.
has made it very clear he will never grow up. So this song, it's almost this like retrospect of realizing this person said that they were gonna grow up. And now in retrospect, if I'm comparing him to Peter Pan, I realize the hopelessness and the
Mm.
futility and the emptiness of that promise because Peter Pan is not going to grow up. That is, in fact, the core part of his entire identity. Hook movie notwithstanding. Anyways.
But also, going back to Monty, what you said, like, Wendy's kind of in love with Peter, and Peter's too immature. He sees her as a
Yeah.
mother. And so I think that's the other interesting element of using this as a metaphor here. Cause I agree with you, Jen. It feels like it's a romantic song, but perhaps it's a one sided romantic song where, Peter just don't feel that way.
Yeah, it is interesting because Wendy is clearly special. Like he wants
Yes.
to take Wendy, not that interested in John and Michael. Wendy, he wants them to make the house for Wendy. He does do extra stuff for Wendy, which is one of the things I thought made this metaphor revisiting it as an adult so potent is Peter in the book at the beginning, you get it. You get where Wendy's coming from. Like in Peter the song, there's the line about a natural scene stealer and being a mind reader. Like Peter is very charming, makes Wendy feel very special, forgets about her, like when they're flying to Neverland, totally forgets about her, comes back and then is like, oh,
So
hi.
being in the 2020s coded. It is awful. Such PTSD.
You talk about Wendy being special and Peter going the extra mile for her, but I think also if we see her as that mother figure, mothers are special and boys will go above and beyond and be so nice to their mother. It does not mean they're that nice to other women, or it does not mean that they're that nice to anybody else. The mothers are kind of that like accountability person that they have in their lives for a long time, as the person that is like the center of their universe sometimes. And that's where some of the Oedipus complex comes in, which is like you have a romantic partner, but you're kind of seeing them as just that maternal figure in your life because that's what you really need or crave. And so I wonder how much of that being nice and going above and beyond is just because of how he sees Wendy and less because of Wendy just being Wendy.
Oh, yeah, I'm super not defending Peter, but what I'm saying is from Wendy's point of view, you
She
kind of get
feels
it.
flattered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's
Yeah.
flattered.
You
He's
made me
very
feel
charming.
special.
He's a natural scene stealer from Peter the Song, which he totally is.
Yeah.
And so you kind of get it. As I was reflecting on this, my takeaway from this song is that whatever the scenario of this song is, that the speaker is looking back at it and saying, not in a like victim blaming way, but kind of a I should have known better. By labeling this other person as Peter Pan, it's you were charming,
Right.
you were wonderful, you were never going to grow up, you were never going to take me that seriously. And in retrospect,
I should have known.
I did not know you were trouble when you walked in, but I know
But
you
I
were
should
trouble
have.
now. And yeah, I
Right.
should have known. That's like
Yeah.
what I really that
I see it
labeling
all
him
now that
Peter.
you're gone.
Yeah, exactly. But like the labeling this other person as Peter Pan
Yeah.
Yeah.
is
Defining who this person was in hindsight.
yeah, and like I think that was why I wanted to start off by saying we don't know what happened to this other person. Like maybe the other person did sort of grow up in some other ways, but didn't come back for Wendy. We don't know. Like it seems like they're lost in some ways of what happened after the parting. This person never came back. Could have grown up for someone else. Like there's so many
Right.
stories of that where it was an immature relationship, you break up and you both grow
And you
but
move
not
on.
for each other. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But this feels while this song is about Peter, after having thought about this, I am now quite convinced that this song is less about Peter and more about the speaker reflecting on what happened and why things ended up the way they
Mm,
did from the speaker's perspective
interesting.
and where they are in the story of what happened.
I think it's very clear that no matter what the adaptation or interpretation, being called Peter is
Not a
never
good
a
thing.
good thing. Peter Pan equals not good.
Not a good thing.
Yeah, it kind of feels like someone you would have a crush on in high school, but not the
Yeah.
person you want to marry.
Yup.
It's funny and cute when they're 15, less when they're 35.
Peter Pan syndrome. It is
Exactly.
so real. It exists.
But like also at the same time, there's sort of an in between. where you don't want to completely grow up. Like in the
Right.
end of Peter Pan, the book, the way the boys grow up is very boring. Even the Lost Boys. It's kind of Wendy who ends up in this middle where there's a line at the end where she's talking to Peter when he comes back for her daughter. And the book says, she let her hands play in the hair of the tragic boy. She was not a little girl heartbroken about him. She was a grown woman smiling at it all, but they were wet eyed smiles. So she was like happy, but like
But
kind of that
sad.
happy, sad. But
Nostalgic.
yeah, she found that medium, it feels like. Because I also think some of this of like Peter being so charming is like you were saying, Monzi, we don't want to lose that childlike innocence.
Yeah.
And so sometimes that is the appeal of the Peter Pan syndrome of the grown men is like, but they've kept something I
They
lost.
believe.
But there's a middle ground we should be aiming. Like we don't want to reject that either. It's interesting going from innocent to here, where this song like feels, the more I get into, the more nuanced it is. Where it's like,
Yeah.
don't be immature, don't refuse to grow up, don't grow up like too much
Well, that's where I
though.
think Cardigan maybe is the happy medium because it
Yeah.
does, and we'll get into this in the deep dive, but you get the dichotomy
Yeah.
between two things a lot: vintage tea, brand new phone. So the old and the new. We have chasing shadows in the grocery line. We have, the childhood and the adulthood. So I think that Cardigan does kind of strike that balance a bit more where she recognizes the childhood wonder and the love and the innocence, but also that you grow up.
Yeah.
Right. I think the wistfulness is okay, and trying to remember that innocence and trying to keep that innocence alive is fine when there's acceptance that people move on,
Right,
time
that
moves
you grow
on,
up.
these things exist. But it becomes not okay when the person is just stuck there, which is
Right.
Peter in Neverland. And that is the part where Neverland's not a happy place. Neverland is full of fears. Neverland is full of a lot of problems. And the reason is because it never changes. Time is the enemy in Neverland. And so in that way, it's just divorced from reality.
Yeah, like there's the line that really hits that too in Peter the song. Having Peter the song and Peter Pan the story is very hard to differentiate. Peter the song, there's the line, and I won't confess that I waited, but I let the lamp burn. As the men masqueraded, I hoped you returned with your feet on the ground. Tell me all that you've learned. So these men are masquerading as probably serious adults, and it's like, boo, boring. And she wants Peter to come back, and she's not saying, I want you to fundamentally change who you are. I just want your feet on the ground. I want a grounded Peter
That's all I
Pan.
want.
Which is that dichotomy between
Jody's updating her dating profile right now.
the dichotomy about feet on the ground versus like head in the clouds in
Right,
the way
it's
that
really
we speak
interesting.
is this such a common phrase, and as it relates to Peter Pan, really interesting because of course he can fly, and
Fly.
what does it mean to be on the ground? Speaking of negative things that have to do with the name Peter Pan, I thought of this when we were talking about how being Peter Pan is not good. Fun fact that I learned when I visited Cuba. There was an Operation Peter Pan in the 60s, and it was an operation in which there were 14,000 kids were sent unaccompanied from Cuba to the United States and rehomed because there were these rumors that the government was going to get rid of family rights
Oh
and
my
force
god.
everybody into communist indoctrination. And so all these kids were rehomed, and it was called Operation Peter Pan because they were like the lost kids being sent away.
That's so sad. That's how we're ending this episode?
No, sorry. I just had to say
But she
negative
didn't want to
things.
do Seven the song.
Yeah, 7 was too depressing.
Okay, but really fun story is that in Cuba, the official story is that JFK kidnapped all of those kids. Just
Oh,
FYI.
Jesus. We love a
So
conspiracy
somewhere between
theory.
there is probably the truth, but just wanted to say Peter Pan equals bad. Wendy and Peter Pan, the relationship and that whole adventure equals good.
I don't even know if it equals good. It equals interesting. It was very interesting reading the book and watching the film as an adult. I think it's a
Yeah.
very different perspective. And yes, Jen, to your point, like it's a story written over 100 years ago. So like I have
Yeah,
to keep that in
that is
mind.
key.
That is very key. But the fact that it's a story that we keep retelling, right? Like I watched the 2003 adaptation, not that much changes.
But even 2003 was 20 years ago. I would love to watch a more recent adaptation.
Well, we've got to watch the
I
2023.
I don't think the Jude Law one was met with that much positive um anything, but I could be wrong. I could just not be the target audience, and so maybe I didn't hear about it.
Well, what I think is fascinating in all of these stories, I would argue I do think it is ultimately a good story because it is
Yeah.
called Peter Pan, but Wendy is the protagonist.
Mm,
And you always want to look,
Yeah.
what is the story trying to teach you or mold you or tell you is the right thing to do? And Peter Pan is portrayed as exciting and a hero, but at the end of the day, you're supposed to relate
Yeah.
to
to
Wendy.
Wendy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Wendy chooses the adventure and then she still chooses
Comes
to
home.
grow up. And
Yeah.
she
Come
gets
home.
to
Yeah.
enjoy her adventure. She gets to have that fun part of childhood, but then she also makes the right choice and grows up. Like
Yeah.
the narrative of it is you're supposed to relate to Wendy's journey, not Peter's. He is not portrayed as the correct like decision making model for viewers and
Although I
readers.
will say now that I'm thinking about it, as you're speaking, I always related to Wendy, but I am also a girl. And
Yes.
so I would love to actually follow up with some
With the
men.
5% of men that listen to our podcast.
Well, I'm like, I'm about to hit up my brother. I'm just going to be like, what was your takeaway from the story? Because we watched all the same things. And I do I'm curious about what did boys take away from the
Mm.
story? Was it the same thing? Did they also identify with Wendy or not?
The Lost Boys always reminded me of Lord of the Flies.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder if those boys were
All
based on the
not
Lost
positive.
Boys, you know?
Yeah, possible. Not positive.
No, the Lord of the Flies was written by a British school teacher who hated his rich students. Is
Yeah, but British would have been definitely familiar with Peter Pan too. Right?
yeah, like it might have been relevant, but it was definitely a like kind of a hate.
Commentary on
Yeah.
the boys of upper crust society.
Yeah, it was very much supposed to be rich boys too, which you don't like the Lost Boys, you don't know if they were
No,
born rich or
you
not.
have
They were
no
just
idea.
lost.
They were just
That's actually
lost.
really fascinating. That would be an interesting Marxist criticism thing to take on, looking at Peter Pan, because there's sort of an
There's a
equal
lot in
ground
there.
happening
Well, the way they talk
in
about
Neverland.
in Mr. Darling, like the description of him is he's stocks and bonds and money, and that's like
Yeah.
like that's what he knows, right? Like it was a
Yeah.
very interesting.
Very middle class in early 20th century to
Yes.
be a banker like Mr. Darling, yeah. Well, on that thrilling economic note, tune in next week as we deep dive Cardigan to see what else is in the song.
That's all we have for you today on AP Taylor Swift. Be sure to rate and review us on your favorite podcast app. Follow us on your social channel of choice at AP Taylor Swift to stay up to date. And join us next time as we overanalyze and deep dive into the next Taylor Swift song on AP Taylor Swift.